Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue au Collège Massey. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and also the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. Today is another of Massey Dialogues on the Arctic. We're going to study the climate displacement in the Arctic. And I'm really indebted with this in-depth look at what the future of the Arctic looks like. So without further ado, I just want to say welcome to Massey Dialogue, and let's hear about what is climate displacement in the Arctic.
Many thanks, Natalie, and many thanks to everyone joining us today, and to Massey College, our host of the Massey Dialogues and the Massey is Missing COP26 Climate Series, and this our fourth in our Arctic series, which is being championed and led by Massey Senior Fellow Tom Eckford. And today we're joined by the Canadian Centre for Contemporary History and the World Refugee and Migration Council, who are co-sponsoring this event. Today, our theme is the subject of displacement as a result of climate change, in a particularly unique part of our world, the Arctic. I'm Rosemary McCarney, and I'm Graham Massey Senior Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy, and it's my honor to moderate this conversation among three quite extraordinary Canadian experts, each with their own special vantage points. Professor Suzanne Lalone is a professor of international law and Law of the Sea at the University of Montreal Faculty of Law, and a research associate with ArcticNet, a network of centers of excellence in Canada. And Suzanne did her PhD at Cambridge in public international law. A great welcome, Suzanne, thank you. We're also joined by Professor Brent Doberstein from the University of Waterloo, the Department of Geography and Environmental Management, who comes with over a decade of experience in research and advising and policy on climate change adaptation, particularly in studies of managed retreat in coastal areas, guidelines related to climate relocation and settlement, and we welcome Brent very much. Thank you for joining us. And finally, but not least, welcome to Chief Kluane Ademak from the Kulwani First Nations in the Yukon. Kulwani is the regional chief of the Assembly of First Nations, a position she's held since June of 2018. And I have to say, the youngest regional chief ever elected in the Assembly of First Nations, and a proud Northerner. So welcome to you, Kulwani, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's get started with three remarkable panelists, but a few things just to paint the picture. It is now generally accepted that the Arctic is warming or heating at 3 times the rate of the rest of the planet. We also know that about 1 billion people around the world live on land that is less than 10 meters above current high tide lines. And of those, about 250 million people live on land that is less than 1 meter above current high tide lines. And I was profoundly remembering that yesterday when I had a conversation with the Pacific Islands Small Island States leaders on the issues that they're challenged with climate change and rising sea levels, etc. Well, humans have always moved to other places for a range of reasons, often based in loss. Sometimes these losses are the result of conflicts and human rights abusive regimes. And today we can add climate-related displacement, unprecedented forest fires, loss of agricultural and arable land, too little or too much water, and many other environmental factors are causing or influencing people to leave their communities. Today, we're seeing unprecedented numbers of people around the world displaced and on the move. Estimates are over 100 million people involuntarily displaced. But we're not going to talk about the world today, but rather something very much closer to home, the Arctic. Climate change knows no boundaries, as we all know. So while we can learn from the world, we have unique climate change challenges here in Canada by reason of our unique geography and the unique cultures that inhabit that geography. And especially in the Arctic, it's hard to talk about climate change impact and not talk about ice, tundra, water, and warming temperatures and its consequences, some avoidable and some not avoidable at all. And so let us jump right in. And what I've asked of the panelists is to imagine that we're all sitting together in one room in comfortable chairs and to have a rich conversation. I've also invited them to jump in and do fast chases of each other's comments, and I encourage that. And I encourage our audience to please post your questions, because we want to leave a lot of time for you to also have an opportunity to engage with this remarkable panel. So Brent, I'm going to start with you. Your work and your expertise, and I know Brent is posting some things into the chat room already, but your work and expertise is about how to manage better, more optimally when rising water threatens people and communities. So when you think about the thousands and thousands of kilometers of coastline in other areas in the Arctic threatened by melting ice and tundra, are we anticipating well what the options are? You know, can you speak to some of the proactive policy initiatives underway to provide assurance to Arctic communities and people? And are there best practices in other northern communities that we can look to adapt and adopt for our own home communities? Over to you, Brent.
Sure. Thanks, Rosemary. So firstly, I think we've understood for quite a few decades now that the Arctic is disproportionately affected by climate change, and that portions of that the climate change effects are going to impact communities and infrastructure located in the Arctic. And so that's actually a benefit. We know that displacement is going to be part of the climate change discussion in the Arctic, and we can anticipate and prepare for that in the future. So proactively, we can look to the 80 plus Canadian Arctic communities, and we can assess at the community level the likelihood that climate change will lead to displacement of some sort or another. And we can do the same for the infrastructure that's currently in the Arctic, the roads, the buildings, the airstrips, port facilities, communication, transmission lines, and pipelines. And so we can, almost on a site-by-site or a case-by-case basis, we can anticipate the effects of climate change, and we can think, okay, if conditions are changing and this might trigger displacement, what should we do about that for communities and for infrastructure? We also have, I think, examples from other communities in the Canadian South where perhaps a flood disaster has led to an understanding that flooding conditions are changing, and this might lead to a need to resettle or relocate that community. And so we can look to examples of community relocation that have already taken place in other locations, in other parts of Canada even. We've done research on community relocation, and we know to a certain extent what works and certainly what doesn't. There are many examples of failed relocations or relocations that have triggered some negative effects as well. I guess I just wanted to also mention in the Canadian Arctic the conditions that are leading to this understanding of potential displacement. We know that sea ice is declining. We know that that climate change is triggering enhanced coastal storms. Obviously, sea level rise is added on top of that. And in multiple locations, permafrost warming and permafrost melt is happening. And so, those conditions together are leading to significant coastal erosion in many parts of the Canadian Arctic and in many communities. In some cases, 30 or 50 meters per year of erosion. We also know that inland hydrological regimes are changing as a result of climate change. So that may lead to changing flood conditions. So again, this is all part of what we know and what we already anticipate, and certainly our ability to be proactive in thinking about displacement and the needs. What are we doing already? I think I'll start out by saying that there is certainly more to be done, and hopefully Kulwani can talk more about some of those initiatives that are being done locally. At the federal government level, there's something called the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, a multi-billion-dollar fund, which provides for proactive responses and resilience building for climate change. That's particularly focused on infrastructure, but sometimes community and infrastructure is tied together. So that's one initiative. The Arctic Council has a working group on climate change adaptation. The same with the Assembly of First Nations, which again, Kluane can speak to. And other government jurisdictions are looking at climate change at the territorial level and at the federal level. I'll just close out here by saying, or I guess it's a caution, there's no one single agency that's responsible for coordinating a response to climate change adaptation or to coordinating community moves. So that's a caution that I think will lead to a kind of a springboard for discussion.
Right. Thank you so much for kind of setting us up like that, because I think that we often think of, when we think of displacement, we tend to think of it at a human level, but it's also about infrastructure that can then trigger that human response or that human obligation or responsibility to leave when one can't mitigate or rebuild or structure appropriately.
Yes, that's right. And I would just think of the ice roads that so many communities depend on in the Canadian Arctic. And if those ice roads are now freezing up 3 to 4 weeks later than usual and melting 2 to 3, 4 weeks earlier, what does that say about access to Canadian Arctic communities?
Right. Super. Thank you so much for that. And that leads it really nicely to Kulwani, because Brent has already spoken about the multi-jurisdictional complexity of managing this, that there's no one single place. So as a Northern First Nations leader, you know, maybe you could speak a little bit about Northern leadership in the face of a rapidly changing Arctic climate. And because we assume that parts of the North and First Nations communities are in fact faced with greater social vulnerability from climate change than perhaps other communities, from, you know, things like the wildfires that, you know, are increasingly further north, the permafrost melt, invasive species, food insecurity that Brent hinted at with the ice roads, etc., and just loss of keystone species, cultural keystone species like salmon and caribou, as well as the extreme weather events that may become even more so. Is this conversation happening from your perspective as a Northern leader in terms of relocation or managed retreat discussions? Are they part of the difficult Northern conversations you're having, and where best to have those conversations given this multi-jurisdictional, multi-institutional complexity that Brent hinted at?
Thank you, and really pleased to be joining you from the traditional territory of Kwanlindan and Ta'anquichan, otherwise known, of course, as Whitehorse. I'm really pleased to of course join incredible experts, and as is our custom, important to introduce myself to provide a bit of context about where I'm speaking from. Dunjay, Kluane Ademak Uye, Daklawedi Ayahat, Agayo Hatu Asauk, Asua, Agnes Johnson, Southern Shoshone, Uye, Asia, Russell Dixon, Tlingit Enoch, Gunach Chish, Kwanlin Dun, Gunach Chish Ta'an. So what I shared with you is that, yes, I'm a citizen of Kulwani First Nation. I'm from the Daklawedi Killer Whale clan, and my grandparents, the late Agnes Johnson and Russell Dixon, Tlingit and Southern Shoshone speaking peoples. In terms of what we see on the ground, so to speak, I want to begin by sharing a story. And this story dates back to, as we know from our anthropological, research and evidence, and as we know through our sacred songs and teachings. That the story that I'm going to share is about the Ducklawady, the killer whale people. And the story, as it was shared with me, was about the clan. And so years ago in the southeast part of Alaska, there was a great flood. And so after the great flood, of course, peoples moved inwards. And so we became inland Tlingit people. And over time, we stayed in the inland, and as things progressed, people wanted to start to displace, to move back to their traditional territories. And during that time, they were, of course, traversing and came to a huge glacier. Insurmountable, and discussions arose amongst the clan. Would we go around? Would we go above? How would we navigate through? And so it was the matriarchs, Awaste and Yekdushe, who chose and were chosen to go through this really small opening that they saw. And so they traveled through this glacier, and there's a song about this and about them reaching the other side. And the reason that it is so important to share that story is that for Indigenous peoples in the North, this what we refer to now as climate change is something that we always knew was coming, and something that we've always had to deal with. Now, the reality that we're dealing with today is that it's not just something that's been caused by Mother Nature, right? We're really dealing with a people problem. In 2021, not so much about what the environment or the land, the shifts, the adaptation that it goes through, but a lot of what we're dealing with today is because of human beings. And so this is where that story of the glacier, the ways in which Indigenous peoples have always had to continue to be resilient and adaptable in times of hard times, so to speak, that we've always had to be responsive to change. So when we talk about Northern leadership and how Northern leadership, Indigenous leadership specifically, is showing up for climate, you see incredible strides being taken. The Vantakwichin, and one of the first communities to declare a climate state of emergency that then rippled to, of course, First Nations across the country. We here in the Yukon have our own Yukon First Nation Climate Declaration, and had a gathering just about a year ago where we gathered with youth and elders and with leadership to talk about how we're going to respond. So this is something that in the North, of course, we're taking very seriously, but it is those impacts directly that we feel, like thinking about stories my grandma would tell me about the different times, for example, that she'd be able to go out and get fish. Right now, over the weekend, my dad was ice fishing, and normally you'd be able to do that into April. But of course, things are changing, and the lake is changing. It's dropped by 10 feet in the last 10 years. So this is where some of the real live impacts of access to fish, access to, of course,
that they're going through. We need to be mindful as human beings. We're all sharing in these experiences. So, this is where it really comes, I think it really circles back to worldview, and making sure that we're always being mindful of those who are realistically dealing with these lived challenges, and on the ground, so to speak. You do see a lot of communities that are responding. There are experiential farms in a number of different communities. There are, of course, solar panel projects and wind projects. But when it comes to the how does it feel, what feels different in the Yukon, there's a lot more that we can also continue to explore and to talk about.
Thank you so much for that and providing that that perspective of on the ground. And I, as you spoke about this songs, and that's where resilience comes from, is knowing your past and how ancestors came through naturally induced climate change, and how does that build capability and capacity for, as you indicated, the people induced acceleration of climate change as well. But that we'll come back to community, because I think that's usually where things are best done. That's where things start, and that's where things get resolved. And so that's an important part of this. I'm going to turn to Suzanne, because Suzanne Kulwani, brought us to the community and the North, and your focus has been on the legal regulatory framework governing much of the North, and in particularly the High North. And I've heard many experts that we need to be more specific when we talk about the Arctic, and having framed up this conversation as one large homogeneous space that. But it ranges from forests in the southern Arctic to the Arctic Ocean and high seas. And so across this vast area, there are international rights or international obligations, there's territorial rights, there's provincial rights and obligations, there's constitutionally entrenched rights of Indigenous communities and people. So a major trigger for involuntary displacement is often loss of livelihoods and local food sources. So when you think of the North and the work that you do, and the ongoing debate, for example, over the Northwest Passage Transit and fish stocks and the rights to fish in those waters and international waters, not international waters, are we equipped to manage safe transit as the shipping corridors potentially open up further from that as a result of global warming, from the perspective of marine animals and the fisheries that are relied on by those coastal communities? Do we have the protections we need for the coastal communities and their futures?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Rosemary. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be participating in this discussion with such experts. In my little world, because law of the sea is my interest, climate change in the Canadian North, if you're going to zoom in, has to do with the melting ice and therefore increased accessibility for ships. And so a legal dispute over the Northwest Passage, which was kind of an esoteric academic debate among people who needed to publish, perhaps, has taken on real meaning because there is already a slight increase in the number of ships coming into the Canadian Arctic. And I think the good news is that Canada has always insisted on a strong legal position, claiming those waters as our own internal Canadian waters. And when I say ours, very inclusive. And having done so, that gives us the power and the authority to get it right. But we have to get it right. I think we start from the basis that in the Constitution, the federal government is given legislative competence over navigation and shipping. So it's like a federal head of power. And I'm hopeful, I hope I'm not being naive, but I see a certain evolution. If I can, a few examples. So in 1996, Canada's Ocean Act in the preamble speaks of collaboration with territorial governments, Indigenous and coastal communities, which is already a good step. Fast forward now 2016, when the federal government launches this ambitious ocean protection plan, suddenly the word that's being used is Indigenous co-management for Canadian Arctic waters, already stronger. And in the Arctic policy framework, fairly recently, the words is now shared leadership. And I think if those can be transformed into real-time, effective commitments and engagement under the water, then I think we're on the right path. And indeed, as Rosemary, you mentioned, this co-management or shared leadership commitment is actually a constitutional duty. And there are tools available to help us get it right. That is to say, to manage, govern responsibly, to act as stewards, as a general family, different government agencies, territorial governments, land claim agreement organizations and bodies. For instance, I think a lot of the Northwest Passage routes are in Nunavut, and the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement confers significant authority and responsibility to different bodies. If I could just mention a couple, if you look at what the 1993 Land Claims Agreement, how it defines and what power it confers on the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, for instance, it's quite strong. The board has the authority to designate and identify, vulnerable wildlife areas, and to put in place conservation measures, and it can even designate within the Nunavut settlement area some conservation areas to protect wildlife, but also habitats, and also culturally and cultural activities within those waters and other values. And then the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board can make recommendations to the Nunavut Planning Commission that is still working on a pan-territory land use plan, but already has regional plans in places. And those plans seek to protect, of course, vulnerable wildlife habitats and the wildlife itself, but also Inuit harvesting activities and socioeconomic interests. And the Nunavut Planning Commission has the authority to inspect every project proposal for the Nunavut settlement area. And for instance, a cruise ship voyage is a project. And so then there's authority to evaluate how those projects meet or don't the land use plans, and land, it includes the waters. And then you have the Nunavut Impact Review Board that can say, okay, your project can go ahead, but you'll need to make these or those adjustments, and you have to commit. So all I'm saying is that there is a sharing of governance in the North. And even in those activities where maybe we're more federal, like Transport Canada and the Coast Guard's initiative on the corridors, I have tracked that over a decade, and I think they went in kind of gung-ho, and there was a community consultation branch, but it's been wonderful to see that aspect of the initiative take on more and more importance, and taking more time to talk to local communities and say, hey, if we put a shipping corridor here, does that meet your needs? Tell us what you need. What would happen? What measures can help protect, the mammals that you rely on, or your harvesting activities? So I think more and more, I am encouraged. I have to say, I seem to see a greater commitment to co-management and shared leadership.
And so you're optimistic in terms of, that question, do we have enough protections? And I'm sure there's a lot of work still to be done in terms of, as things change, we will identify gaps will emerge and holes will emerge. It sounds like a pretty robust patchwork of regulation and international and legal. And sometimes I wonder, though, when international entities, institutions, or corporations or governments kind of arrive in the Canadian territory of the Arctic, I suspect they're kind of stunned by, in fact, the extent and span of the legal regulatory framework that they must deal with.
Absolutely. I think there are many layers. It goes back to Brent's comment about a lot of agencies involved. And so I think, there was a presentation by the president of the Small Tourist Association, and he was claiming, he was making the point that their members find the Canadian system. So you start with Transport Canada, and then you talk with every territorial government, and then there's like all the way down to hunter and trappers organization. But Transport Canada has also published, a guide. You do this, you talk to these people, and I think the answer is, yeah, okay, so yeah, you have a lot of people to chat to and to reassure and to convince that your activity isn't going to create any stress, strains, or damage or problems. And I still think that's the way to go. Now we just have to make sure that coordination. We have to work, I suppose, on coordination perhaps, and making it a smooth dialogue between different partners in that process.
Right. Well, thank you for kind of laying out, because it's a complex area jurisdictionally, without question, but an important one. I mean, the complexity is about protection and choice of Northerners. And so, Kulwani, you must find as a Northerner some irony. I'm sure some frustration sometimes, but it's also the kind of irony in descriptions of the North by people who have kind of historic and perhaps stereotyped, romanticized perspectives of the North. And, as it continues to change at an accelerated rate, the environment underneath the feet are changing probably more quickly than in the past. And so, well, there's human cost, there's also community resiliency, which you so beautifully articulated, as well as emergency planning and adaptation, etc. So some would say these are not new. These are actually things that the Yukon First Nations have dealt with from time immemorial in terms of climate leadership in the face of drastic historic changes and commercial pressures by outsiders that have come in waves in the past as well. So, I think that when you think of the Yukon, geography has put you with a land border with Alaska, which has taken a very different path, and very much a different constitutional path, and a sea border that's near the entrance to the thing Suzanne is paying attention to, the fabled Northwest Passage. What are the hopes for, as you have these great conversations with the communities in the Yukon as well as across the North with the AFN, in terms of, do the opportunities outweigh some of the well-funded fears of the impact of increased commercialization on the Yukon and on First Nations people of the Yukon?
Right. Certainly, and I think anyone would feel that way if someone or others were talking about you instead of with you, right? So I think that's where, as Northerners, and this is why it's so great, to see Massey College, and this is, I think, should be taken, in a really positive way. Like, we need the balance, right? We need the balance of science and modern and Western science and academia with traditional knowledge and experience living on the ground. Because if we can equip ourselves with all of that information and knowledge, then we're going to be able to come up with the best and most optimal solutions. So that's always something that my grandma has had taught me, was that you need to balance the knowledge that you have, from an Indigenous perspective in terms of who you are and what you know, with what you can acquire through Western knowledge, in this case for me, through post-secondary. So I want to start there. And when we talk about, the solutions, and I think back to, climate change, and I think about Greta, who talks about, we need to be responding like our house is on fire. And I really want to acknowledge, as we have these conversations, like all of the young people around the world who I really do believe have showed incredible leadership in really pushing and pressing for change, of course, through change makers, whether that be through elected leadership or through our, of course, knowledgeable experts. But really, I think when we talk about the solutions, when we talk about what it is that we need to see, I think it's really important that we start to really unpack what I think the biggest difference here is really about worldview. And I know that, in terms of some of the really specific examples, we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about mitigation strategies, we're talking about data and reaching targets of lowering emissions. We also need to talk about worldview and how important it is for people to understand who may not have experienced being in the North or living in the North, and thinking about the Vantakwichin up in Old Crow, that going out on the land would equate to going to the grocery store. Eating caribou is something that people in Old Crow and in many other communities across the Arctic, that is an everyday practice. That is like one of the major parts of their diet as Northerners. So I think this is where there really needs to be that grounded understanding and knowing that for the North, as the peoples who are most impacted, it's really interesting that we haven't been the ones to create this issue. This issue has been created by the world, by human beings, by us not responding to this, 30 years ago. So this is where I think it is really important to acknowledge the difference in terms of lived experiences. But this is also where we need to see strength in terms of coming together as human beings to respond to this people problem, but also to come together as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, because that is the way that we're going to be able to come up with the best solutions. But of course, led for and by the North has always been something that we hear, and I firmly believe to be true. And from an Indigenous perspective, led for and by Indigenous people. So partner with us, but ensure that you're also spending the time to really understand what it is that the day-by-day experiences that are lived by the people on the ground, what those look like. And I would just want to lastly acknowledge, I recognize I'm speaking more from a really specific example perspective, but again, that's another teaching is, don't speak about what you know, don't try to speak about what you don't know. And I think that's where, as Northerners, we speak about what we know because it's what we live. And so that in and of itself, I think as human beings is absolutely a knowledge pursuit that we should all consider, so that we're able to really be authentic and genuine in our approaches.
Well, thank you for that. And also thank you for reminding us about the role of young people, because they're often the ones who say, nothing about us without us. And that's such a good reminder. And Massey has just one of its hallmarks is the importance of intergenerational dialogue. And you have been talking about intergenerational dialogue since we started, in terms of the teachings and your grandmother and the stories, et cetera. And so you're kind of the living example embodiment of something that Massey College tries to keep fostering in terms of the role of the junior fellows, et cetera, at Massey. It's really important to keep in mind that, and there's historical precedents and traditions about that as well. Brent, maybe you can jump in as a follow-up then to Kulwani, because you've seen and modeled many threatened coastal populations around the world. So, what needs to happen for adaptation or relocation, only if necessary, managed retreat to be successful, for communities and people to be able to be participants rather than have the environment force their hand too dramatically, or perhaps policy, people, capital cities react too dramatically without involving them and the lessons that they are so well placed to share. Can you share with us some good practices in southern coastal communities that might serve as a model, or even northern communities that you think are doing it well?
Sure. So I think we can learn from both northern and southern community experiences with displacement from disaster or displacement from climate change. Alaska, as an Arctic experience and context, is going through Currently, the relocation of one coastal community, Newtok, and that's been ongoing for almost a decade now. And they're looking at another 15 or so coastal communities that may be faced with the difficult decision to relocate inland or at least away from threatened coastal areas. So, the Canadian Arctic can learn from those experiences in Alaska. That's where we learned that there's no one coordinating agency, and that posed a huge challenge for the community of Newtok. So we can get ahead of that, and we can think about best practices in terms of either designating or thinking about a coordinating body to coordinate community relocation. We also know, as was mentioned, relocation should really be considered a last resort. So we should be exhausting all other possibilities of adaptation in place, or adapting communities for the changing realities of climate change rather than moving. But in some cases, relocation will be unavoidable. So we know that. And as I mentioned earlier, we can also get ahead of the curve rather than waiting for truly disastrous conditions like a winter coastal storm that's eroding 50 meters of coastline or a flood. We can think more proactively about that and plan for a more proactive relocation before disaster hits. I think that's critically important, and that's what we've learned from other southern communities that have had to relocate because of disaster. It's a very chaotic time to coordinate relocation after a disaster has happened. I think has been mentioned by all panelists, the critical need to engage with communities or to have community-led relocation. That's been recognized in almost every case study on community relocation that I've come across or been involved in. These are not decisions that should be made for communities. These are decisions that should be made by communities, perhaps informed with the expertise of others as needed. And that was mentioned just by Kulwani. So communities will live with the decision to relocate, and they should be involved in every level of that decision making. Having said that, I do think we also need to think about resource requirements for displacement and relocation for both infrastructure and communities. So at one point, there were discussions at the Canadian federal level of a permanent fund and program to coordinate community relocation, either for disaster or climate change purposes. I think that's been shelved and put on hold because of the pandemic, but those conversations continue. But to have a standalone fund and program that's ready to support community decisions to relocate is critically important, I think. Because otherwise you are more or less trapped in a cycle of deciding to relocate and then trying to figure out how to fund that relocation from a multitude of different agencies and government levels. Other kind of best practices, or I guess tips that we've learned from other community relocations, really to put the community culture front and center when it comes to making that decision about relocation or how to relocate. And in some cases, communities will decide not to relocate the entire community, but only portions or only certain functions in that community. So for example, there may be one neighborhood that's more threatened by flooding or by erosion than another, and that can be coordinated and incorporated within the existing community rather than the entire community moving. But I think that decision has to be made in mind of the community culture and what's critically important to that community. Maybe the one final best practice or good practice that I could recommend or I guess distill from other cases is really to think strategically about what to do with the land that you're retreating from. And if that land is eroding, well, maybe you don't need to think about that so much. But in the case of flooded property or flooded land, maybe you move critical infrastructure and housing out of the flood-prone areas, but you retain that land for recreational purposes or green space or naturalization, or perhaps a heritage use. in the Canadian Arctic. Those floodplain areas, while threatening for housing, might still be very important for heritage use, for traditional cultural uses. So, that's I guess it's important to consider the context of the community that you're thinking about and how you're going to use those retreat lands going forward. Those, I think, would be some of the practices that have come out of other case studies and other communities.
I'm glad you raised the issue of how is this going to be resourced? And one of the things that seems to be endemic for us is that we're better at reactive funding in the face of a disaster than we are in preparedness funding. And right now we're involved in these discussions with respect to the pandemic and how do we in fact fund for pandemic prevention and preparedness, and front end load special drawing rights, et cetera, from international financial institutions, so that it's front end loaded, because they're okay at funding after the fact, the reaction, and how do we then accelerate reactive funding into the front end when we need it. But it's the same type of issue, same type of debate. And you mentioned earlier the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund of the federal government. Has it got that front end load that you're asking for in terms of preparedness?
Yeah, so the DMAF, or Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, has a fund available, and that's a standing program. And so communities can apply to that program if they're hoping to enhance community resilience to climate change. And the particular bias or focus of that program is on infrastructure. So if you can, prove to that fund that your plan to increase the resilience of infrastructure in your community will work, then they will be willing to fund you proactively, not in a post-disaster context. Unfortunately, it seems to be human nature to need to wait for a disaster before significant action and funding flows. And that's very unfortunate. As we saw from the pandemic, we knew from the 2003 SARS epidemic that there was a potential for these kinds of novel diseases to burst upon the scene and really disrupt communities. We knew that 18 years ago. We took some actions related to SARS, and it seemed to die out before the latest pandemic then hit. The same seems to be true for community displacement and relocation. We wait for the flood that then destroys or damages houses before we make that firm decision to relocate. So, it's critically important to get ahead of the curve and to, in something like climate change that we know is unfolding over 10, 20, 50, 80 years, to try and anticipate that and prepare for it before we're forced to deal with it.
Right. One of the things that Brent said a couple of times, Suzanne, was, can we get ahead? And can we get my question would be, can we get far enough ahead, knowing what's coming, knowing what's almost inevitable? There's some things we can do, but not all. So when you think about the changing environment in the Arctic, it's both social policy and climate policy. And so I'd like to move you to more of the international legal frameworks that to manage Arctic activities, and because we've talked about the domestic landscape and the intricate web of constitutional rights and obligations, etc. But in terms of the North, when you think about the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage and the Transpolar Passage, they all kind of line up together just up the coast from the western boundary of, for example, the Yukon, where Kulwani plays a leadership role. And even today, there's hundreds of ships moving through this area that are threatening food security, altering a way of life that's reliant on the ice. Do you think we can count on the tradition of among the 8 Arctic states, the declared 8 Arctic states from a territorial basis? they've relied on consensus and cooperation for a long time. I think it was Brent mentioned the Arctic Council, and Kulwani mentioned the AFN's network of agreements, etc. in anticipation. Are you optimistic that we can protect the legitimate interests of the Northerners with the international pressures and legal instruments and tools we've got today?
Well, I think it ties in very nicely to what Kluane was saying and Brent, in the sense of not waiting for disaster to be upon us. I actually feel that the A8 are committed, and it's actually maybe even selfish. In the name of their own interests, they're saying we're the best positioned to take the strongest measures regionally. We should see the Arctic like a region, just like the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. And so as Arctic coastal states, we have, you know, a premier role to play. And I think even internationally, we have responded. I think the international community has responded. If you think of the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code, the recent traffic separation scheme for the Bering Sea, Bering Strait into the Arctic Ocean, that was proposed by the US and Russia jointly. So they worked jointly on this proposal. And it did target as well the need to protect biologically and culturally important waters. That's part of the rationale for the traffic separation scheme. And, you know, as you know, we have the Central Arctic Fisheries Agreement, and I'm told that the ICC had a role to play in the negotiations of that instrument. So for me, it's a bit like, I think Brent was saying, we have lessons learned, we have some incredible information about relocation, but have we put the money to actually help it happen? And in my world, it's, we have the rules, but can we enforce them? Who's watching? Who's like, how do we surveil these rules and make sure they're respected? Because if they're being put in place to protect fragile marine environments and cultural activities and even, you know, food security, it's not enough to adopt the rules. You have to make sure they're being respected and enforced. And within the Canadian Arctic Archipelago, we have some really innovative mechanisms like the Inuit Marine Monitoring Program, where, you know, local Indigenous monitors with the knowledge, the actual on-the-ground experience are helping, and it's tying into the Coast Guard, and that's fantastic. Outside the archipelago and the greater Arctic Ocean, I think there's work left to be done. I think we could think, even like the Central Arctic Fisheries Agreement, I think we need to make, to adopt more robust mechanisms to check that the parties to the agreement are doing what they're supposed to do, and to monitor outsiders' activities. So for me, that's the only place where I think, and as you mentioned, Rosemary, there'll be gaps as well. It's not as if we have full legal coverage of all the issues, but I'm a little concerned about actual enforcement or effective protection, basically.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the, you know, the issue, your concern around enforcement and accountability, and you've all touched on that in different ways. And I'm going to invite people to pose questions, but maybe I could pose a question to you in terms of, you know, just, and it's to the three of you, what would you like to see spotlighted next so that the right conversations are being held, and your concerns about where gaps, potential risks are actually, using Brent's language, we're getting out ahead of the issue. And can I start with you?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So what would be the priority? So I've already mentioned the idea of a standing fund or program. So I think that's critically important to try and avoid the need for communities or regional governments to have to, you know, scramble to find support for ideas of relocation or reaction to displacement. I also think there's a need for more thinking to do with infrastructure the Canadian Arctic infrastructure and how climate change may affect that. That crosses multiple jurisdictional boundaries. So I think perhaps a focused program could be a research-focused program or an action-focused program that looks specifically at the issue of infrastructure and how climate change may affect that. Maybe one more area is really down to the community level and to try and stimulate thinking at the community level. Communities are dealing with stresses and threats all the time in the Canadian Arctic and elsewhere. And so really to shine a light on climate change at the community level and have those discussions ahead of time before perhaps climate change is causing the need for relocation. So those are the three areas that I could think of.
How about you? What would you like to see in terms of, you know, a place like Massey is, I think one of its attributes is it can put a spotlight on things and bring the right people around a virtual table. What would you like to see?
Shall I jump in, Rosemary?
Sure.
Okay. I was just thinking, you know, I've had these conversations about this like endless Northwest Passage legal dispute, this discussion, and I'm struck by how many of my international colleagues just don't get it. They think this is a Canadian federal government and Canada should be reasonable or whatever language. This, I think we just have to continue and continue. And I try to make my colleagues understand that this is a homeland. This is an Indigenous homeland. It's just a question of respect for the people that live and have always lived and use and inhabit the waters, the land. And I just don't think that message is getting out there, that it's not a capricious legal position on the part of Canada. And so I don't really know, Rosemary, what that looks like. Does that mean facilitating, actually helping Indigenous participants to be part of more Canadian delegations during discussions? Is it taking ads in like the Manchester Guardian? And I'm sorry, I don't have the imagination to, but I do know that I don't think people truly understand the real issue with we need to be careful about shipping and, or, you know, ships and respectful shipping. And I really don't think that message is quite known enough. And so I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think it's a very important point, because I think that one of the things that we did in a maybe appropriate, maybe not appropriate, diplomatic way was when we agreed to disagree with the Americans way back, you know, a couple of 2-3 decades. We agreed to disagree on, you know, the Northwest Passage, and by doing so, you know, I think very typical fashion, we kind of backburnered it. But you know, it might have been easier to deal with then than today, when there seems to be more claimants to having a stake in the Arctic, you know, from faraway countries or in the Arctic Council, and then the commercial competition for scarce resources, natural resources, that it's almost more complicated to have that discussion now. But it was, we might have clouded the issue by saying we can agree to disagree, and maybe it is time. And I think your ideas are as good as anyone's in terms of helping people, the international world, understand, no, we're serious about this, and we're serious about it for the following reasons. And it's the same when, you know, international people come into the North, that no, we're serious about the jurisdictional issues, that, you know, you have to deal with many, a constellation of authorities and responsibilities and ownership in the North. It's not window dressing. It's not meant to be a boundary setting. It's how we work. And I think we've got to, I think we have to be very assertive and confident in asserting that as well. Yeah. Kulwani, how about you? What would you like to see?
You know, I think firstly, and we talk about, you know, solutions. we have to make sure that at every place and space where decisions are being made, that Indigenous peoples, women, and young people are included. In the Yukon, we are very much a matrilineal people. And so this, of course, with respect to worldview, is a very different way in living and being than we may see from a Western colonial worldview. And so certainly when it comes to solutions, we need to see, again, those really, really important voices part of the decision. So my question and what I would like to see is in any of these conversations, how are you not only including, but how are Indigenous voices part of the solution and part of the decision? How are women's voices part of the decision and part of the discussion? And the same would go to young people. That absolutely is the first. I think the second is to really acknowledge that we need to find a path forward as it relates to working together as partners and being collaborative. And there are a number of examples of how this can work. But at the end of the day, what we really also need is for Indigenous peoples to be equipped with the supports and resources to be able to continue to create solutions. So for example, here in the Yukon, we actually have a youth climate fellowship. And I really want to acknowledge the Walter and Gordon Foundation. They have a fellowship, of course, for Northerners, emerging leaders, so to speak. And so we started our own fellowship in the Yukon for Yukon First Nations youth and emerging leaders in climate, because we recognize how important it is to not only create that space and place for bi-directional learning as it relates to our knowledge keepers, but also, the research and academia communities, but to ensure that we're equipping the next generation with all of the knowledge that they need to be able to continue on. Because the reality is, the decisions that we're making today aren't going to affect us, right? It's about how they're going to affect the future. And so that becomes, I think, part of the conversation that we don't often really truly think about is the decisions that we're making today and how they're impacting those who are coming behind us and very quickly. So that is, I think, at the core of what it is that we need to see, both from a national, international, community, regional perspective, is to ensure that those voices and perspectives and knowledge are included in all of the work.
That's just a great to wrap up this conversation, because you brought us back to the richness, just the essential nature of intergenerational and multi-generational dialogues. And I've been working in something of this winter on the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response. And so I've had the opportunity to speak to, thousands of people around the world, but groups of youth around the world. And we often use the expression in our conversations about, build back better after a disaster or calamity. And they've been very outspoken, saying, we don't want to build back at all. We want to build forward, because back wasn't good enough, and just improving or making it better is not good enough. It's about building forward. And I've taken that to heart in terms of that different perspective and lens that they bring on, because as you say, Kulwani, it's not about us. It's about that generation and many, many, many generations that are going to inherit this in the future. So it's a wonderful place to end. I do note that we've come to our time. I wanted to say, first of all, thank you to all of the three of you. Just a wonderful conversation. I'd love to continue, and to everyone listening, this will be live and up on YouTube in the next couple of days. And we've been ably supported by Alyssa Ginsberg and Matt Gladue in the background, so thank you to that. But I need to do a special call out to the principal at Massey College. Nathalie Dergosier, because she has the strongest commitment and vision on the contribution that Massey can bring as a trusted convener of difficult and important essential conversations and this global challenge of climate change as it manifests itself and hits different communities in different ways, in differentiated ways, and the knowledge that can be brought by having everyone around that table, not just taking a seat, but as important participants that we need to hear from. So let me thank that leadership, because I think, as you've all said, leadership matters a great deal. We're really pleased, Kulwani, that that you're holding that very complex leadership role in the North. But as academics, Suzanne and Brent are influencing young people as well every day, and that's fundamentally important as well. So thank you all very much for joining the Arctic series, and thank you to Tom Axworthy for being the brainchild and bringing this all together. I know all of you know the formidable Tom Axworthy. So thank you all for today, and thanks everyone for listening in.